Hi everyone.
G'day.
Welcome to Parkside Online. We are so thankful that you've joined us, and I think this conversation is going to be really good. We're going to be talking about storms and stillness, and we hope that as you join our conversation you might experience the nearness and the peace of Jesus.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I was on a ice climbing trip with a few friends, and we were moving from basically where the road ended out to the mountain where we were going to climb, and we had to cross a few hills, few rises, few valleys, and we came to one valley, and running through the valley was a river, and we were trudging through the snow. Everything was iced over, and darkness was falling. It was actually starting to snow. And we had an idea that there was this river somewhere, but it was mostly covered by the snow. And so we didn't know. And we had a bit of a debate. Do we stay where we are for the night, or do we push on and hopefully then get to where we need to get to the next day? And after a bit of a chin wag, we decided we're gonna push on. We're gonna push on. And so we all spread out and kind of identified as best we could where the river was. And then someone found like a bit of an opening in the snow so you could see the river coming through. And so we said, right, we're going to cross here. So we grabbed our packs and hoiked the packs across. And then I think I might have been the first one. And I don't know if you've ever tried to run and jump in snow.
No.
That's what we had to do. And it was, maybe
it's one or the other, but
maybe 2 meters. And so I'm like, here we go. And our side of the river was coming down like this, the other side of the river, run, jump. And then I kind of hit and managed to rock forward. But as I hit, the snow gave way, I tumbled in, and I was soaked up to mid-thigh as we continued to trudge through. But we got to where we needed to, but we needed to get anywhere. We had to cross over to the other side, and we're going to explore a little bit about that tonight. And so if you're playing along at home, we're drawing some inspiration from the Gospel of Mark, and we're going from chapter 4, and I'm just going to read from verse 35 here, and it says, as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side. Big connection there. The other side of the lake. So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed them. Soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking in the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples, his students, woke him up and said, Teacher, don't you care that we are going to drown? And when Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, Silence, be still. And then he asked them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And the disciples were absolutely terrified. Who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, there's a lot that we can explore, but the first thing is obviously the point that we opened with, which is crossing over to the other side. If you read this story, like this lake that they're on, what's the lake called?
Galilee.
Yeah, Galilee. Yeah.
The Sea of Galilee, Lake Gennesaret, like there's a few names, but
yeah. And so on the side that Jesus was on was actually the place where he grew up. Town of Capernaum, which he feels like was his hometown. The people there were predominantly Jewish people. He was familiar with the customs, familiar with the traditions. On the other side, there are two regions, and one is called the Decapolis, or the 10 cities, and the other one is referred to a bit more as Galilee of the Gentiles. And what that meant was that in those two regions, there were different cultures, there were different practices. This group of people may have met someone that they understood, but chances were they wouldn't. They were going across into the unknown. And I just think that simply stands out as one of the messages that if we are wanting to follow Jesus as we move through our lives, that part of following Jesus is going to the other side. And that can look like a lot of different things in our lives, but going to the other side. Sometimes it can be as simple as walking across the other side of the room to talk to someone that you are not comfortable. You've got a bit of a story there?
That's what I was just thinking of, like just in a very simple term, because we can go, oh, I'm not going somewhere big, I'm not going to the other side of the world. Maybe God will call some of you there, but it can be that, maybe you've got a prompting where I need to go and talk to that person. And it's, the other side of the room, or the other side of, a building when you're at work, the other side of the yard. If you're in an education setting, who knows? But it can be like maybe it's 2 steps, maybe it's a whole boat ride.
Yeah.
But,
and even for us, as we've started to share Jesus with people, what we found is that when we walk over to other people, very rarely will people refuse a conversation. We don't control where the conversation goes, but when we start, and for us, we started at the side of a park and we would go across to maybe where someone else was. We'd go to the other side and we'd talk to them. And I think that's the challenge. Where we are right now, we're in the middle of an unannounced election campaign. And I think one of the invitations of Jesus followers is actually to understand the other side. And not to try and triumph politically, but to look at things from the other side, to see, and that might not change how we vote, but it might. I think another challenge of going to the other side is exploring injustices in your community. For us, like we're in the very beginning of exploring the injustices that are still going on towards our First Nations people here. For me, I live in a country where most of the power is held by white men. It would be easy for me to continue on my life, stay where I am, with what I know, with the culture that I'm familiar with. And yet I've felt that there's something in me that wants to see justice happen. We're still exploring that, we're still working out what that means, and we certainly don't think we've got all the answers, but in stepping onto the other side, I feel I have actually experienced some of the transformation that Jesus comes to give. When I'm dealing with a conflict at home, I can come in with what I know to be true and with what's worked for me in the past. But actually, when I stop and listen and go to the other side of this discussion, that's when transformation happens in me, but also in the situation. And as you are watching, I want you to take a moment to reflect. When was the last time that you went to the other side? That you left the known? And that might be culturally, that might be in a location, that might be an occupation. But when was the last time that you left what was known and stepped over to the other side, whatever that may look like? Because that is the invitation of God. Let's go to the other side. And it's in the other side in this story that we see that all the change takes place. If they'd stayed on that side, the storm might have passed through, but that particular region was known for having some pretty heavy storms out on the lake. And when we're talking here, the storm is heavy. I mean, when we read earlier, what were the words describing the storm that stood out to you?
Huge, fierce, ferocious. It was, the boat was feeling like it was going to sink. Waves were were going over into the boat. So it was
waves breaking over the side. Yeah, which is terrifying. A friend of ours this morning around this table shared a moment. They chartered a fishing boat, and he's not a seagoing guy, and they were inside Sydney Harbour, but the waves were so big that as soon as the boat came out of Sydney Harbour, the waves were crashing over the front, and the experienced fishermen said, no, this is too big for
Well,
us.
because the boat was like the side rails were actually in the water.
Dipping in the water, which is a crazy experience.
Yeah.
And I want to just embrace this moment here, the reality of the moment. We can poetically use the description of a storm.
Yeah.
And I think that overlooks the detail of the challenge. That this story happens, and there were people in this boat that were not fishermen, that were new to this game. And when we read the story, words like terrified and frightened and afraid, they think they're going to die. Like this is a reality.
Yeah.
And I want to just take a moment. If you've grown up into in some religious circles, you may have heard people try and minimize how severe the situation is. You may have heard sayings like, it's okay, just believe, from people who have no idea of the depth of the situation that you're finding yourselves in. And yet here very clearly, this is a real situation. There is real fear. There is real risk. And I think it's important to note that as we follow Jesus, often he will lead us into moments of real risk where there aren't guarantees, and like in this story, there may be a risk to your life. Like I had a conversation with a business consultant in the city of Chennai in India, and he was telling the story that for 1 month he would run his business consultancy in the cities, and business consultancy, you can make a lot of money, and he said he would charge enough money that then he could live without working for the next 11 months, which in itself is huge. But he's basically just living on rice and whatever he could. And yet he was living in a region of the country where there had been rioting, where there had been cultural rioting, where people have been killed because they have a different belief. He didn't see that as something that to be avoided. But he saw that challenge, that real risk, as something that he took on. And he said, I would love to have a family, but the life I live, it just would not be fair. And I wonder, as we think about crossing over to the other side, like what is the risks that we are embracing? Again, in our country, it's pretty easy to talk about faith and really not take too many risks. You can avoid risks to your reputation. You can avoid financial risk. You can avoid physical harm. We've got laws, and yet I know there are others who will watch this, and your risks are real. And because you're taking on real risks, that does not mean anything is wrong. It does not mean that God is there, not there. But that is what Jesus invites us into. And when we see here, sometimes too, it can even feel like it does here, that Jesus is asleep. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're asking, does anyone care?
Oh, lots of different ones. But even, sometimes I still ask why. I was diagnosed with cancer a couple of years ago, and, even now, with all the treatment and walking through different things, I can go, why? And Jesus, are you there? I mean, I prayed and I believe and I know that he was walking with me, but I think even in those situations, you're facing a diagnosis and health stuff that you're going, no one else understands. No one really knows how it feels. And you can start to feel maybe alone, or like, you're on a sinking ship, and will something change, Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually a pretty human response to question, is anyone with me? Like, we want to belong as human beings. And I think when we connect with Jesus, it can feel like, he's asleep, But I think this is a little bit challenging, because One particular translation says this next line like this: after all you have seen, why are you still afraid? And if you thumbed back through the pages here, you would discover that this group of people have witnessed Jesus do incredible things. Like the stories are, some of them were willing to leave jobs to follow this teacher. Some of them, they've witnessed people who had lost control of their bodies suddenly be given back control of their bodies. They've witnessed people with sickness get healed. They've seen a little bit of opposition from institutional authorities. And I think there comes a moment too in our lives where it's important to ask ourselves the question, well, what have I actually seen?
Well, I think that's what helped me even in that one situation with the diagnosis and going through treatment. Not going, because now I'm in this tough situation, that God mustn't be there, but I looked back at all the times in my life where I know that God has been walking with me, where he has provided, where he has helped. It doesn't mean that he's going to do exactly the same thing in each situation.
Well, very rarely happens, does it?
That's right. But I could go, he was faithful then, he will be faithful now. I don't know how it's going to all work out, but because I could look back at what he'd done and who he is, and as I read in the Bible, I could go, okay, don't know what's happening tomorrow, don't know what's happening and what the outcome is going to be, but I know who I can trust.
Yeah, I think that's courageous and powerful. I think the other side of that is you have that record, that list, because you have taken steps. You've taken action in the past based sometimes on the promise of God.
Yes.
I'm going to make this choice, and what's guiding me ahead is the promise of God. And it's only after you look back sometimes that you can discover, I took this step based on this promise of God. I can now look back and say, he kept his promise.
That's right.
And this is perhaps a difficult question as we're looking at this. When you look back and say, what have I seen? If you've got a short list, if your list is long, maybe this is the moment where you need to take a step of action, where you can sense God is inviting you to move from here, from knowing all about this stuff. You might know the stories, you might have memorized parts of this book here, and yet God is inviting you to act. And I know for some of you watching this right now, you realize this is your moment. That the words that you're hearing now are intersecting with a decision process in your life, perhaps a decision that you've been procrastinating against, perhaps a decision that you're still researching. And yet there is an invitation here to take action and to start to build that list for you, to start to see God at work. We all want God to work, and then we step into that work. But actually, it's we act, and then we discover this retrospectively. And I think it's crazy because the group of people here were more scared when they saw God work, almost than they were of the risk and the danger. And that's powerful. When you have the courage to take that step of faith or that step of trust, actually move from just knowledge into action in your life. Often leaving behind things that you are familiar with, cultures and ways of thinking, crossing to the other side, often into an unknown, that we see God do things that honestly are absolutely awesome. And so we want to invite you tonight to take a step of faith, to perhaps cross over to the other side, to move from just knowledge into action. And there will be moments of real risk. There will be moments where you perhaps may feel fear, and yet that doesn't mean anything's wrong. It doesn't mean that God is absent from your life. And so if you are ready to take this step, we're going to invite you right now to just pray a simple prayer that says, Jesus, I give you my life. And that may be your anxiety. It may be the decision that you're weighing up now. It may be the previous experiences that you are holding on to. Jesus, I give you my life. Give me your life. Let me follow you into the next step, into the next season of my life. And if that's a decision that you're prepared to make, then let's just pray now. Jesus, I give you my life. Give me your life. Jesus, I give you my life. Give me your life. If that's a decision that you made while you're watching this, we'd love to support you in any way we can. If you're passing through Southwest Sydney, we'd love you to join us around this table.
Great.
Alternatively, jump in the comments on YouTube or DM us on our social media channels. And we look forward to the day when we can have this conversation face to face. God bless you.
Bye.